Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and maybe your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for the thrilling second half of Episode 10, Chloe's Light. Last week, we learned about Chloe's powerful gifts. We met her unique friends and were left wondering whether Shane Damascus would help take care of Chloe's poltergeist issues, or just make them worse. Now, on to part 2 of Episode 10, Chloe's Light. Suddenly everyone gasped as the planchette began to move, pointing to different letters on the board. X, A, K, L, G, R. Shane peeked out of one eye and looked at Janet. What did I spell? He asked. Nothing, she said. It's just a bunch of random letters. Ugh! Shane muttered in disgust. I can't do this with my eyes closed, Janet. I have to see what I'm spelling. Fine, she said. Just keep it simple. 5 or 6 letters max. Last time you kept misspelling Beelzebub, and it took us 20 takes to get it right. It's a hard word, Janet. I was trying to be creative. In spite of herself, Chloe smirked again and glanced up at Rob, who wore the same bemused expression. Soon, though, Chloe's patience wore thin and she stopped smiling. After his second attempt to spell out Satan, Chloe burst out, How is this helping us? She ignored her parents' efforts to quiet her and stepped over to the table, looking at Damascus. You're just trying to make stuff up that'll look good in your show, but you're not trying to help us at all. Everyone in the room tensed as Shane stared at Chloe in surprise. After a moment, Shane shook his head, then locked eyes with Chloe. Janet, he said loudly, I cannot work in these conditions. Can we do something about the interruptions? Please. Janet made her way over to Chloe and grabbed her elbow to steer her away from the table. Chloe, we are trying to help. This is a part of the investigative process. Yes, we're adding some, she made air quotes, drama, but we are trying to help with your situation. Just let us do our thing, and I promise we'll fix everything. She beamed down at Chloe, then called over her shoulder. I think we've got enough here. Let's move on to the seance. She strode into the living room, and everyone trailed after her. There was a breeze coming through the broken picture window, and the sofa still sat in the front yard, surrounded by bits of stuffing and shards of broken glass. Janet paused, looking momentarily surprised, and to Chloe it looked as if she'd forgotten that the couch had flown out the window. But Janet quickly regrouped and pointed decisively at the love seat. Shane, you and Elaine sit on the love seat. The husband sits here. She grunted as she moved a wingback chair directly across from the love seat. Then Chloe, she pointed back toward the kitchen. Someone grab a chair from in there. Janet stepped back as a different crew member carried in a chair. Then she beckoned for Chloe to sit and clapped her hands a couple times to get everyone's attention. Okay, folks, this is a seance. It requires a lot of concentration and can be dangerous if not done correctly by a professional. Let Shane do the talking and don't say anything unless he specifically asks you to. Shane, you good? Damascus shot her a thumbs up and took a deep breath. He sat up straighter and suddenly grabbed Elaine's hand and turned to face her on the sofa, knees touching. Chloe sighed as her mother flushed a little again. Elaine, I know you're frightened, and I certainly don't blame you. There are forces at work here that are just beyond your comprehension, but I will do my best to vanquish them. Will you be brave for just a little bit longer? He grasped her shoulder, and despite the darkness, Chloe saw her mother's face redden even more. She glanced at her dad, who just sat there with his arms crossed, glaring at the two of them. Without taking his eyes off Elaine, Shane said, Janet, we ready? The producer simply said, Go. Shane reached out to Chloe, who was sitting on his right. She extended her hand. He grasped it tightly and said, "We must join hands to create an unbroken circle. Come, join." He nodded to Gary, who reached out and took Chloe's and Elaine's hands. "O spirit world, hear us now. Send through your messenger and give us your guidance. We bid you enter this home in peace and share your knowledge with us." Chloe suddenly felt uneasy. She didn't know much about seances, but it felt wrong to just openly invite whatever into their home. It didn't help that Rob's expression had turned from anger to worry, and he was shaking his head slowly in disagreement. Everyone held their collective breath for a moment, but nothing happened. Shane continued, undaunted. "Is there a spirit with us now? Can you tell us what evil lurks in this home? I command you, give us some sign you're here with us." Suddenly, Chloe felt a chill in the air. She was facing the broken window and for a brief moment saw a large black shadow slide through the window. It felt different than the other dark shapes she'd seen. It seemed darker somehow, darker even than the shadows in the living room. Rather than darting around like the other shadows she'd seen, it glided slowly and purposefully up to the group, hovering just out of the light cast by the flickering candles. Shane continued to talk. "Tell us your message, spirit. Give us your aid in vanquishing whatever evil permeates this house and help me save this family." He pumped his arms in the air dramatically, wrenching Chloe's and Elaine's arms upward with his own. Damascus paused to take a breath and slowly lowered their arms. He smiled into the camera and said, "I hear them. The evil has fled this place, and we are—" His voice was cut off by an unnatural shriek that reverberated around the living room. The candles snuffed out, and the room was thrown into darkness. Chloe's parents cried out. "Help!" Along with the few of the crew members. Shane leaped to his feet. "What the fuck was that?" The fear in his voice was real. "Janet, what was that?" He dropped Chloe's and Elaine's hands, but Chloe didn't notice, since her attention was riveted on the black mass hovering in the corner of the room. It was blacker than the rest of the room, and it was slowly coalescing into a tall figure. First arms, then legs appeared. Then the torso seemed to solidify along with a large, oddly shaped head. It took Chloe a moment to realize the oddness of the head was due to a couple of large, protruding horns. She bit back a scream and watched it stride quickly across the room to touch the cameraman nearest the door. He screamed in pain. "Owie, owie, owie!" and dropped the camera, beating furiously at his neck. "It burns! It burns!" A light suddenly played on the little group of people clustered around the cameraman. Janet had turned on a flashlight and was holding it steady as they pulled the screaming man's hands away. Even from where she stood on the other side of the room, Chloe could see 3 angry red scratches etched into the man's neck. The man bent over, then straightened abruptly, staring straight at Chloe. His eyes were completely black. "I've come for you, child." The voice was guttural and deep, and it resonated in Chloe's head like a swarm of angry bees. Bzzz. The cameraman turned and punched the nearest crew member in the head, then shoved Janet aside as he stalked toward Chloe. Janet fell, the flashlight bouncing from her hands and casting flickering, chaotic shadows. It came to rest, pointing at the wall, provided a dim, ambient light for the room. Gary jumped from his chair and stood in front of the possessed cameraman, blocking his path to her. Although he was about Gary's size, the other man simply grabbed him by the throat and lifted him up from the ground with ease. Chloe heard her father's wet, gurgling breath and raced over to help him. She pulled at him, screaming at the other man to let go. There was a bright flash, and the entity howled "Ow!" as it was knocked out of the cameraman. Both the crew member and her dad collapsed, and Chloe saw a shape that looked a lot like Alexios whisk past her. Whoosh. Chloe stooped to pull Gary up, and her mother stumbled over in the darkness to help. The cameraman staggered to his feet, and they stared warily at him. but his eyes were wide with panic, and he just turned and dashed to the front door, yanking it open and running out. "Janet, what the fucking hell?" Shane screamed from his chair. "You said this would be an easy shoot. I didn't sign up for this." But Janet ran out the door with the rest of the crew, so Shane stood, bumping Chloe aside as he made his way to the door. Rob stepped forward and pushed Shane, who staggered backwards a couple steps. "Who pushed me?" The smaller man looked around in terror, flailing his arms around. Rob was yelling at Shane to close the seance when the dark shape lunged forward, grabbed Rob, and threw him across the room. "No! Rob!" Chloe screamed as the man disappeared through the doorway to the kitchen. Damascus turned away from his unseen assailant and sprinted to the broken picture window, vaulting out into the yard. Chloe continued calling Rob's name, trying to find him in the dark. As she fumbled around, she felt the same chill she'd felt earlier, and with a jolt, remembered the malevolent dark shape. She whirled to look for it and realized she was alone in the living room, with the dark form standing only a few feet away. The front door creaked eerily shut.
Eerily.
And clicked closed. The faint light from Janet's flashlight sputtered and died.
Pleh.
Chloe could still see the shape, which was darker than anything around it. Although she couldn't discern facial features, she knew it was watching her. Then she heard a deep-throated growl that made the hairs on her neck stand up. It raised an arm towards her, and Chloe felt her chest constrict. She began gasping for air. And from far away, she heard her parents outside screaming her name as they pounded on the front door.
Bang, 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 Chloe!
Suddenly, Alexios bounded into the room, thrusting a spear at the black mass, which recoiled and darted back into the corner of the living room. The man leaped forward, stabbing with the spear. This time it penetrated the shape, and Chloe felt, rather than heard, a screech of pain. The shape quickly dissolved, and Chloe sucked in a lungful of air. "This is what I was trying to warn you about." Chloe turned at the sound of a new voice and saw Mark outlined dimly at the foot of the stairs. The Greek man strode over to Mark, simply passing through the furniture in his way. "It's going to get a lot worse if you don't do something soon," Mark continued. "But why does it have to be me? He seems to be pretty good at getting rid of that stuff." Chloe pointed at the warrior. "He can protect you, but only for so long. This is something that has to be done from your side. That idiot opened up a doorway, and so now even more dangerous things are going to come through. You have a really bright light, Chloe." A bright light? What does that mean?" she asked. Outside, her parents continued yelling for her, and their voices were getting closer. "Living people give off a kind of light that we use to navigate or communicate," Mark explained. "Some people's lights are way brighter than others. But that light attracts both good and bad, which is why it can be dangerous. And your light is so very bright, sweetheart." Chloe was startled by a second voice, which sounded like her dad's, but saw that Paul was standing next to her. She smiled at the sound of her grandfather's voice and started to say something, but Mark cut in. "There's something else coming through." Mark pointed toward the picture window, where a breeze from outside was rippling the curtains. The air in front of the window had turned blurry like a heat haze, but she could make out a vague shape coming closer. Paul stepped closer to Chloe and said, "You have to close that portal, Chloe. I know you can do it." He put a hand on her shoulder, and she could actually feel the weight of it, which was comforting. He began to fade again, along with Alexios, and then Mark whispered in her ear as he faded, "Find Rob. He can help." And then he too was gone. Rob! She'd almost forgotten, and she whirled around, eyes searching the shadows for the man. She called his name,
Rob!
keeping a frightened eye on the dark mass that was looming on the other side of the portal. She could hear a faint pounding,
Bam, bam, bam,
as her parents continued hammering at the front door, but all sounds now seemed muffled and far away. She made her way to the stairs, still calling for Rob.
Rob!
"I'm here." He walked out of the kitchen and hurried over to her. A ghastly laugh filled the room. and a sinister voice said, "So am I." Together they turned, and Chloe gasped at the figure squeezing through the portal. It wasn't an amorphous black blob like the earlier figures, but had clearly defined features. It stood about 7 or 8 feet tall, with large curved ram's horns atop what looked like a lion's head. Giant arms, ridged with iridescent scales, ended in sharp claws, and it walked on heavily muscled haunches like a goat. Its massive hooves left scorch marks in the floor where it stepped. Chloe wrinkled her nose at the strong smell of sulfur.
Ugh.
"Chloe, remember your protection," Rob whispered. She nodded and closed her eyes, but the creature's booming voice cut into her thoughts. "There is no protection from me, child." Its voice was deep and grated on her mind like nails on a chalkboard. Rob stepped in front of Chloe protectively. "You're strong, Chloe. Stronger than you know. Now shield yourself, damn it." She tried to visualize her heroic armor flowing over her body, but was distracted again, this time by Rob walking over to stand in front of the demon. He held up his hand like he was trying to give it a high five, but to Chloe's astonishment, a bright light shot from his outstretched palm and spread into a wall of light as the demon recoiled with a grunt of pain.
Yeah.
"Now, Chloe, close the portal." Rob staggered as the demon suddenly slammed a massive fist into the light wall. "I don't know how," she screamed as she ran over to stand next to him. Smaller, dark shapes erupted from the portal. About the size of large dogs, they flitted around the room and then started circling Chloe and Rob. She could actually hear them growling, and flinched as one of them darted at her. She felt it collide with her, but there was no pain, and it flew across the room, repelled by her shield. Another dark shape hovered in her periphery, and she turned, yelping in surprise. All the furniture in the room was hovering and slowly rotating, and she watched in amazement as it began to spin around faster, as if caught in a silent tornado. "Chloe, focus!" But she couldn't. She kept glancing at the spinning furniture, and then Rob screamed in pain as one of the dark shapes grazed him. The large demon then slammed another fist into his light wall.
Boom.
Which started to flicker, and Rob sank to one knee. "Rob!" Chloe reached for him, but he waved her away. He struggled back to his feet and winced in pain as another dark shape darted into him. She moved to stand between him and the shapes, but now there seemed to be hundreds, swirling amidst a cacophony of growls and shrieks. All at once, Alexios was back, bounding into their midst, spear whipping from one target to the next. At his heels were Mark and Paul. They each swung, grappled, and kicked at the evil minions, distracting them so she and Rob could banish the demon. It quickly brought both fists down on Rob's flickering barrier, shattering it, and sending Rob flying backward again. Now there was nothing between Chloe and the massive creature. The stench was overwhelming, and she backed up a couple steps. She desperately wanted to turn around and look for Rob, but something told her not to take her eyes off the demon this time. She trembled in fear, but then felt her grandfather's warm hand on her shoulder as he passed, intercepting a minion. She felt instantly better and stronger. Suddenly she understood. The light of good memories and love would be her most potent protection against evil. She drew in a breath through her nose, pulling with it a flood of happy memories, birthdays and picnics and family vacations and all the little moments of love that she'd experienced in her life thus far. She heard Mark shouting at her, "Banish it, Chloe! Hurry!" Then a cry of pain as Paul was bombarded by a cluster of shadow creatures. She took a defiant step forward and raised her hand as she'd seen Rob do, but instead of a wall, a glowing suit of armor melded itself to her body, brighter than ever before. "You are not welcome, and I banish you," Chloe shouted. But the demon merely chuckled and said, "You are too weak to banish me. You have no power." The words buzzed inside her head. And for the first time since the demon had appeared, Chloe wasn't afraid. She was angry. Actually, not just angry, enraged, furious. All the pain and fear she'd experienced throughout the evening fell away, and the only thing she wanted at that moment was just to smack that demon in its stupid, smug face. Her right arm felt curiously heavy, and she looked down to see her protective armor had morphed into a wickedly sharp-looking sword. Without thinking further, she leaped forward and slashed the demon across the face, leaving a smoking furrow diagonally from forehead to chin. It screeched in pain and surprise, backing up a step. She kept swinging and began screaming at it. She didn't know what she was saying, but the words felt right, and each time she connected with her sword, there was a sizzle and a screech as the demon grew smaller. At first, it swung back at her, but its blows glanced off her armor harmlessly, and it retreated, holding its arms up protectively. Chloe wouldn't relent. Hacking and slashing, she drove the creature back toward the portal. Occasionally, one of the smaller dark shapes would rush in to attack her, but she paid them no mind as they bounced off her armor.
Boing!
Finally, the demon was pressed against the portal. It had shrunk to the size of a small man, and Chloe screamed, "You are banished!" a final time as she drove her sword straight to the demon's chest. There was another hiss and a shriek of pain, which was the loudest yet. Then it seemed to collapse in on itself and abruptly winked out of existence. Chloe dropped to her knees, eyes squinted shut against a pounding pain in her head. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder again and looked up to see Rob looking down at her. She was happy to see he seemed unharmed, but his expression was serious as he helped her back to her feet. "Chloe, you have to close the portal." He pointed at the blurry mass that still hovered in front of the living room window. "But I don't know how," she said. "Just say, 'I'm closing this seance. No more spirits are allowed here,'" he responded. "That's it?" Chloe gasped in disbelief. "That's all we had to say?" "Well, now it is. You had to banish the demon first." He smirked and nodded his head in the general direction of the group gathered outside. "But, yeah, you wouldn't have had to do any of that if they'd just closed the seance in the first place." Chloe turned to the portal, repeated Rob's words, and watched as the blur faded, along with the remaining shadow figures. Mark, Alexios, and Paul walked over. "Nice work, Chloe," Mark said. Alexios nodded in mute agreement, and Paul gave her a huge smile and a thumbs up. Rob turned casually to the three ghosts and said, "Thank you. We wouldn't have been able to do it without your help." Chloe's jaw dropped. "You can see them?" she asked Rob. "Yeah." Relief flooded through her, knowing she wasn't alone, and she felt like crying again. But before she could ask any of the million questions that was swirling in her mind, the front door burst open and her dad ran into the room, followed closely by her mother. "Chloe, it's not safe!" Rob sidestepped as Gary rushed over, eyes wide in panic, and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the doorway. Elaine stepped forward and reached for her other arm, but Chloe stopped, tugging her arm from Gary's grasp. "Guys, it's fine now. See?" She swept her hand around at the furniture that had resumed its original positions. The room was still dark, but all traces of menace were gone. The parents looked around, and she could see the panic leave their faces and their shoulders relax. "Rob helped me," she gestured to him, but her parents ignored him as they clutched her in a three-way hug. She sank into her parents, and all three of them stood there like that for a few minutes, an island of contentment, until a crewman walked in with a handheld flashlight, blasting bright light into every corner of the living room, followed closely by Janet. Wincing at the light, Chloe could make out the form of Shane Damascus standing on the porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot, obviously afraid to enter the house. Janet strode up to the family, looking nervously around, and said, "Well, that was surprising. I think we've got what we need. We'll have to review our footage, and then we'll set up a time to go over our findings." Over Janet's shoulder, Chloe saw Rob head to the door, then pause and give her a little wave before walking outside. Janet finished talking, and without waiting for an answer, she bolted from the room, followed closely by the crew member with the flashlight. Chloe wanted to thank Rob for his help, so she detached herself from her parents and followed the rapidly departing film crew. But by the time she made it to the yard, all the SUVs had sped away. She stamped her foot in disappointment and returned to the living room. In the following weeks, everything returned almost to normal. The windows were fixed, the sofa replaced, and there were much fewer incidents involving dark shapes. Finally, they received a phone call from Janet, who invited them to Shane's office to discuss the results of the investigation. When Chloe and her parents arrived, they were escorted to a large room decorated in black with candles and other creepy items, paraphernalia from Shane's previous shows. Janet was standing in the corner surrounded by the other crew members that Chloe recognized from the house, but she didn't see Rob anywhere. Finally, Shane strode in with a cocky smile and sat down across from them. He was holding a small remote in his hand, which he pointed at the wall. Various pictures of Shane snapped on and off as he narrated his tour of the house in a low, gravelly voice. And last of all, he lowered his voice to almost a whisper and started playing a video. "This is the moment when our very own cameraman Carl was viciously attacked by this evil entity." Before he could continue, there was a cough from across the room. Shane straightened with an annoyed look on his face. "What?" The cameraman who'd been attacked sheepishly raised his hand. Shane glared at him and repeated the question. "What? What is it? Why are you interrupting me?" The man cleared his throat again. My name is Evan. That's Carl." He pointed at another crew member across the room who breathed a little "hey" and shot a finger pistol at Shane. Fine." Shane settled himself and repeated his line again, this time using Evan's name correctly. The clip commenced with shaky footage of the cameraman clawing at his neck. The imagery was almost as chilling the second time as Chloe shuddered inwardly, remembering the sounds and chaos of the moment. But there was no footage of the cameraman's attack. The video skipped to Shane on the sofa, pumping his arms. Chloe narrowed her eyes as the clip played. It had obviously been heavily edited to make it look like everyone except Shane had fled the room. As the clip ended, Shane grinned at Elaine and Gary. "So, has there been a decrease in the activity since we left, Elaine and Gary?" "Well, sure," Gary replied. Shane clapped his hands briskly and said, "Looks like we fixed your problem, folks. Another one for the good guys." He held a hand up for Gary for a high five, who looked confused for a moment and then grasped his palm in an awkward inverted handshake. Elaine repeated the gesture, tapping her palm against Shane's. When Shane held his hand out to her, Chloe just folded her arms and glared at him till he dropped it and looked back at her parents. She remembered the way Shane had pushed her down and the terror of the encounter. Shane began to say something, but suddenly Chloe cut him off. "You're a fraud." Her voice was low but clear and rang out across the room, and she heard a collective gasp from the crew as Shane sat up straight. He leveled a finger at her and opened his mouth to object, but she overrode him again, her anger cresting into a wave that forced her from her seat. She pointed her own finger at him and raised her voice. "You're a fraud and a cheat. You didn't fix the problem, Shane. You caused it. You opened a portal and then ran away, while someone else had to fix it. But you're the hero? If anyone's the hero, it's Rob." Shane stammered. "Rob?" But while she had originally been irritated at his pompous attitude and the way he'd portrayed himself as the hero in the video, she now felt a deeper, more mature, more intense, heated anger. Until now, she hadn't really thought of anything beyond Shane's behavior at her house, but her blood ran cold as a series of questions occurred to her. She didn't want to know the answers, but felt compelled to ask anyway. "How many other families have you tried to help," she wagged her fingers in air quotes, "with your stupid seances? How many portals have you opened? How many times have you ran away? How many people have you hurt and left hanging because of your hubris and stupidity?" She banged her hand on the table,
Bang!
emphasizing the words. Shane's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. A bony hand clutched her arm. Chloe didn't need to look to know it was Janet, but time seemed to stop as Chloe felt a strange power course through her body. She felt lighter and stronger and, oddly enough, calm. Without turning or even moving her arm, Chloe just shoved with her mind. Janet staggered backwards across the room with a squawk, pinwheeling her arms for balance and crashing into Carl, both of them thumping into the wall.
Boom.
The room erupted with people leaping to their feet and shouting, but Chloe was oblivious. She snatched a pen and pad of paper from the table and pushed it toward Shane, leaning forward to lock eyes with him. Give me a list of all the seances you've started and never closed. Shane gaped at her for a moment, then just nodded and started scribbling. Chloe straightened and looked down at the people that were her parents. They looked unfamiliar to her, just a couple of frightened middle-aged folk slowly rising out of their chairs. She glanced around the room indifferently at several other people who were gaping at her with naked fear and pressing themselves against the far wall. But almost as quickly as it happened, the indifference faded, and her calm was replaced by disorientation. She blinked rapidly, weaving slightly as her mother put an arm around her. Elaine was saying something, but Chloe couldn't make it out. For a moment she'd felt so detached, as if she was looking at the room and these people through someone else's eyes. Her parents were ushering her now from the room as the film crew moved as far away from her as they could. She vaguely remembered getting angry and saying something to Shane, but she didn't know why that would have caused the looks of fear in her eyes. She felt a nudge at her elbow and turned to see Shane Damascus, his characteristic grin replaced by a look of curiosity mixed with fear. He pushed a piece of paper into her hand, and she remembered asking him for some kind of list. She put it in her pocket without looking at it. "Rob is the only one who helped us," she repeated, jabbing a finger at Shane. "The rest of you are just cowards." But Shane looked genuinely confused. "You said that name before. Who's Rob?" She sighed and pointed to where Rob had been standing, but he wasn't there. She looked around the room but didn't see the man. She dropped her arm and faced Shane again. "He's on your crew, Shane. At least make the effort to remember their names." Shane gestured to the room with his arm. "This is my crew. This is it. Nobody named Rob." Chloe stared at him, then glanced at the other people, most of whom were still pressed against the wall. Janet nodded slowly to confirm what Shane was saying. Wait, so who's... Suddenly, realization struck Chloe, and she stepped back quickly, and without another look, she ran from the room and out into the bright sunlight. She heard her parents following her, asking questions, but she couldn't answer. There were too many thoughts swirling in her head. Thinking back, she realized she'd never seen anyone interact directly with Rob. Of course, it made sense now, but while she was grateful for his help, she couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. She'd thought he would be her ally on this plane, someone in this world who would truly understand her gifts and be able to help her convince her parents and everyone else that she wasn't a fraud or crazy. Embarrassment, anger, frustration, sadness, all competed for space in her mind. Now she just wanted to sleep for a year. Elaine and Gary lapsed into an uncomfortable silence as their questions went unanswered. She stared out the window as they drove home. When they arrived, she stumbled from the car and up to her room. She slammed her bedroom door.
Slam!
And threw herself onto her bed, pulling her blanket over. Within a few minutes, she was snoring softly. An hour later, the door cracked open and Chloe's parents tiptoed in. Her mother adjusted the blanket to cover her better, and her dad closed the blinds and curtains, dispelling some of the light in the room. He paused, glancing at a shadow in the corner, but when he looked at it directly, it was gone. Chalking it up to nerves and fatigue, he joined his wife at the threshold and quietly pulled the bedroom door shut. "I think he saw me," Mark said to the other men standing in the room. Alexios and Paul nodded their agreement. "That may not be such a bad thing," a second voice said from the corner. They all turned to look at the newcomer. "If last night is any indication, she's going to need all the help she can get when we start closing the other portals." Rob stepped out of the corner and stood at the foot of Chloe's bed. "Think she's still going to help us after all that? She's pretty pissed at you," Mark asked as the other three spirits took up their places around her. "I didn't lie to her," Rob said defensively. "I knew she'd figure it out eventually." Paul harumphed, and Mark shook his head. "We need her to trust us, man. You know this." Rob hung his head. "She doesn't know exactly who you are yet. Are you going to tell her who you are to her?" Rob looked at the sleeping girl. "I don't know. It may be too much to handle right now. She's so much younger than I remember." "Yeah, but she's pretty smart," Mark said. "Yes, and brave," Paul added enthusiastically, beaming with pride. "She is powerful," Alexios chimed in gruffly. "And she's really the only one who can help us," Mark finished. "We've got a lot of work to do, and she's the only way we're going to win this war. If it comes to it, you're going to have to tell her." Rob nodded again sadly and stood with the other spirits, each sworn to protect her in the coming fight between good and evil. The end.
The end.
Thank you for joining us today on episode 10, part 2 of Chloe's Light. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
And we wanted to do something special, something different for our 10th episode. So we wrote a really long story and essentially just chopped it into 2 parts. So, I don't know, I feel like we should do like our commentary. But we're so bad at just improvising commentary.
Kind of, yeah.
So this is probably where you would say, how did you come up with the inspiration for the story?
Okay, Dark, how did you come up with the inspiration for this story?
I'm glad you asked. I don't know. I think I was thinking of some different stories and I started writing and kind of fell into a hole in the paper. And this is what came out. I think it still feels a little unfinished to me if I'm being perfectly honest. But I wanted to get something out. I thought it was at least good enough to hold people's attention for now. But I might revisit Chloe's universe. Actually, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This is all the same universe.
You know what? I'm not surprised.
All my stories are happening in the Dark and Precious version of the MCU.
Okay.
So, for those of you who are sharper-eared listeners, you might even recognize a character that was in multiple stories, or at least more than one story. And if you do, I think you would actually be ahead of Precious, because I don't think she remembers.
I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm like, what?
I just love that you're so dedicated.
And so who did you model Shane Damascus after?
Oh, well, I don't want to name names, but let's just say that I modeled him after he's kind of a composite of a couple of popular celebrities who have adventures with hunting ghosts. We'll leave it at that.
Okay. But it's not after Shane Pittman because we love him.
Shane Pittman, no. I've met Shane Pittman, and he is a genuinely sweet guy.
Definitely.
In the very unlikely chance that Shane Pittman ever listens to this podcast, Shane Pittman is awesome. And Shane Damascus is in no way based on Shane Pittman, the legend.
Well said, Dark.
Copyright pending.
You know, when we were at Paracon,
Michigan Paracon. Yes.
Paracon, yes. When we were at Michigan Paracon, you were able to schmooze with people, and I was just like, you know, with my mouth hanging open, standing there just starstruck, going, I don't have a single thing to say. And usually I won't shut up.
Well, this is true, but this was also out of my comfort zone, and I made I made an effort to like push myself out there and just walk up to people, and I would kind of stand in a group where, you know, because very few of these people that we call celebrities, you know, the famous folks in the field like Dave Schrader and Greg Lawson and John Belanger and Chip Coffey. I mean, very few of these people are actually ever just standing by themselves.
True.
So the key is just to kind of walk up and just hover around the edges of the group, not in a creepy way, but just kind of edge in there. And then, you know, maybe if they say something that you think you can comment on, then you'd be like, hey, I can talk about that, hey. And then they have to look at you and, you know, acknowledge you. And that's kind of like my go-to. I just jump in, I'm like, hey, I can talk about that.
Well, and it didn't help that, or it did help maybe, that people seemed to think you were a celebrity of some kind.
I know. I walk around, I will say that a lot of people always look at me like, who is that guy? I feel like I know him from somewhere. I've had so many people walk up to me and be like, you know, you look like somebody. And that's all they say, is I look like somebody. Maybe I look like someone famous. But yeah, I was actually talking to Chip Coffey's people. And they were like, you look like somebody. You look like somebody. And someone said, the Baldwins. And they were like, yeah. No, wait. No, that's not it. And then someone else said, Lou Ferrigno. And
someone said John Travolta.
Someone said John Travolta, yeah. And I was like, well, I mean, it's flattering, I guess. But, for the next day or two, I would be like walking upstairs in the, around the dealer rooms and all that. And some random person.
Vendor rooms, not dealer rooms. Makes them sound like drug dealers.
Okay, vendor rooms.
Sorry. Go on.
I'd be walking around the vendor rooms, and some random person would just holler out a celebrity's name at me. One woman screamed at me as I was going in, Jeff Bridges! I was like, okay. That was it. That's all she said. She just shouted the name at me and kept going.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, as you probably figured out by now, we recently went to the Michigan Paracon, which is a pretty big deal. A lot of famous names up there. I mentioned them earlier. Dave Schrader, Steve Gonsalves, John Belanger, Chip Coffey, the Ghost Brothers, and many, many more. So it's pretty cool to connect with all those people. Got to know Greg Lawson pretty well. Super chill guy.
Tim Shaw was there. He was super nice.
Tim Shaw is very nice. I didn't get to meet him, but you did.
I did. He was very sweet.
You even gave him a hug, didn't you?
I may have. I don't know. I hugged a lot of people.
You did. You're a hugger.
I'm a hugger. Because I'm precious.
And that's what people say, like, oh, you're precious. And then we're like, oh, yeah, we are. And then they look at me and go, you're an asshole. Like, no, that's not the name of the podcast. And with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off now. Be dark, be precious, but most of all, be yourself. We hope you enjoyed listening to our story as much as we enjoyed telling it. We're pretty sure you have more friends than we do, so be sure to tell them all about us and click to follow our podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at dark.n.precious or follow us on Facebook at Dark&Precious Storytime. Feel free to leave us any feedback or if you have any story suggestions. Who knows? You might just hear your story idea come to life in the next episode of Dark&Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.